Welcome back, everyone. Certainly glad to have you with us listening again. This is a podcast to answer your questions on addiction, recovery, and mental health by the Wiseman Method Opioid Treatment Specialists and Rapid Detox Center. I'm your co-host, Dwight Hurst, joined today by Claire Wiseman and David Livingston. And we've got a great thing to address today. I find that when we have our question and answer sessions where we're talking about questions that are related to issues of recovery and addiction, oftentimes the best conversations we have are when we have cause to question the underlying assumptions that are built into the question itself and say, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive. And today there's a great opportunity to be able to do that. Our question today that we're going to focus on is legalization or decriminalization of drugs. In other words, should drugs be legalized? Should the legal accountability or the legal consequences for drug use be changed? What do you got? How does that hit you?
For me personally, not well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe so. I believe in the United States, with the lack of good, accessible, effective mental health issues we have, legalizing drugs is just putting gasoline on the fire. And when I mean drugs, I don't mean just illicit drugs. I mean even marijuana. I think what's going on with marijuana right now is insanity.
So you have some concerns about the existing changes to legislation that are happening. That's interesting.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Especially with the patients we see, marijuana can be extremely depressive. You see these kids driving on completely high. They feel lethargic. Socialization becomes an issue. So I think, again, if you got somebody really, really healthy that was productive, that had a full life and was able to, and I'm talking about, not the illicit drugs. I'm talking about marijuana. To use it once in a blue moon, to have fun, like people have a glass of wine, be it. But the way that is being sold to everybody, regardless of their mental health histories and regardless, of their social surroundings, I think is irresponsible. And I think we will suffer tremendously the consequences of that.
Would you be more supportive, or are you more comfortable with a limited use legality for marijuana, like if it was under the care of a doctor or prescription then? Because I know they've done that in some places before.
Yeah.
California used to be that way, right?
Yes, I probably would. Much more than having, marijuana trucks, delivery, stores in every corner.
Yeah. It's and it's a weird relationship now living in the West as I do. I live in Utah and you guys are in California, so of course you've been the location people have gone to for a while, but in the West, with the laws being so different in different states, we're pretty used to people crossing boundaries here for those reasons. Like, oh, there's dispensaries in Nevada, so we'll go over here. And now with it being to where I live, it is essentially sort of like low-key decriminalized to where they're not really arresting unless someone's selling, it seems like. But at the same time, they can get a card from your doctor, but they don't really have dispensaries here. And so people are like, do I want to get a card from my doctor and have the state know I'm doing that when I'm not sure that they're really legalizing? And so having all the different states on such different playing fields is also very it does things to people's behavior that's interesting is all. I don't know what the answer is to that one, but with people residing in different states that border other states with different laws, then you get people doing a lot of let's just say self-management, and self-management of our own medicinal world is sometimes tricky if you are prone to addiction. Because what is addiction if not intensive self-management of my needs, right? And
If yeah, and also if you have mental health issues
exactly.
that are not being properly treated. So yeah, how do you manage that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very interesting way to see it. So that is kind of like two things you're carving out there. One is like use of marijuana is kind of covered under one. It's always been lumped in with just all the other illicit drugs, we could say, because you have. But I think a lot of people look at it in like kind of like different levels, don't we? I mean, as far as the way culturally and legally we tend to look at it is like alcohol, legal, with restrictions. Marijuana depends where you're at, and go back in time enough, just absolutely an illicit drug. And then you have other drugs that then we tend to say more serious, but it doesn't mean you can't hurt yourselves with any other substances before we get to that level of illicit, right?
Correct. Correct.
And then many of those are also available under prescription. So if we're talking about opiates is our main thing on this show, right? So
Yep.
and then you've got more illicit like heroin or methamphetamines or different, things like that. And so.
But this is where I find myself on social media, having these discussions with people that are always saying to me like kratom, okay, that is a drug that
Yes.
we detox. So they say, but kratom is much better than heroin. Well, of course it is. But do we have to choose one evil from the other? Can we just be free of both evils? So this is the constant, discussion. Marijuana is much better than taking painkillers. I understand that. But sometimes when you're using marijuana to treat emotional pain that is not being treated by a professional, things will progress and not in a good way.
And I think you see a similarity there too with alcohol use, right? Because people will use alcohol very dangerously and and die from alcohol use as well, especially when there's untreated mental illness.
I mean, you can give the drug to the person, but if you're giving to somebody that cannot handle the responsibility of that because of irresponsibility or mental health issues, then you have a problem. So the problem might be not the substance as much as it is who is acquiring it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not blaming the person. I am just, bringing the issue that most of the harmful things we have in our society happens because of lack of mental health.
Yeah.
And until we don't understand that, things are just going to snowball like they are.
I think as you put it is, in a culture where we don't take mental health very seriously, decriminalization and legalization of drugs could be very dangerous. I think that's a very interesting qualifier you put there and say it's inseparably connected is what you're saying, that there's a connection there, that if we want to just talk about drugs and the laws about drugs, if that's all we're talking about, we're ignoring the issue that brings up, which is mental health, and how is that going to connect to the availability and use of drugs. So it's kind of a lazy question in a way if we don't talk about what context would this exist within. If we say, if we don't have any drug laws, okay, then what? And we're not going to address any of the other underlying things that would make that a huge problem.
And then that's the reason it becomes a huge problem, because what we are focusing on, it's not the problem. But we always find reasons, especially, and again, I believe in capitalism. That's not where I'm going. But, we are mandated by, pharmaceutical companies and other major manufacturers that are pushing us to believe that the reason we should purchase these kinds of substance, that they are not harmful for us because we need them for reason A, B, C, D. But that's truly not the reason where people are using these medications, including a lot of people that do use opioids. I'm not undermining anybody's pain. I think sometimes emotional pain is harder to live with than physical pain. But I think we're harming people. That's all. It's we're not doing. We can do much better. Let's put it this way. We can do much better than we are doing as a society that has every possible resource out there to truly help people.
David, let's loop you in here a little bit. What are some of your thoughts about when we're talking about legalization or decriminalization?
Oh boy. I'm not sure. So I think in general, we're certainly better off with limits, especially around things that are, the more addictive something is, the better off we are with limits. I think that generally the best way to live is to have as little mind altering substances as possible overall. I understand like the idea of like going out and having a glass of wine at night or something like that. I understand that, unless someone has a problem with alcohol or something, that can be a part of enjoying life. And I understand that's not the case for everybody. But we also live in a culture where moderation is not the easiest thing. And so that's a part of it. And it's complicated. Is it better to decriminalize something and then you'll create a underground or a world in which it will be sort of dealt with from that perspective, and there's problems with that. So I don't think people's lives as you guys are talking about from a mental health perspective, I think if you habituate to any of this stuff, you have a worse life.
Yeah. It's such a complicated thing to look at that and see, are we talking laws or are we talking health? We'll have an intersection there when we look at it and say, well, this person got in they got in their car and drove around a whole bunch while they were intoxicated. And so do we just say, hey, you should stop it? Or do we say, there's a real serious criminal charge, and if you don't do what we're telling you to do here in treatment, then you're going to go to jail like long term. And then you see some people who really turn themselves around with that. I mean, I've worked in court-ordered treatment settings, and I believe that those programs and some of those laws have saved a lot of lives. At the same time, you can't get away from the fact that a lot of people come through those programs like a revolving door only because there's a sword hanging over their head. And as soon as it's not hanging over their head, they don't have a lot of incentive to stay healthy. So you see kind of both occurrences within the same system, right? So it does become difficult to know how do we sort out what the best way to do is. I'm reacting kind of in a it is very intriguing to me. I think we're moving into a place where, to your point, kind of, Claire, I think that we're taking away. I'm trying to say this in a not as confusing a way. One of the things I think is very intriguing is the fact that we're talking about what is the underlying concept of society, right? You both have kind of touched on that, as Claire, as you put it. If we don't take mental health seriously, why are we even messing around with it? And then, David, as you're saying, like, are there rules of what we should or shouldn't do? But, basically, what's the health that we have? And what's moderation in our culture, which has nothing to do with laws necessarily, but how do we look at moderation? Did I say that I tried to say that in as confusing a way as I could. So if I say enough things, I haven't said anything. Right? But basically what I'm reacting to this, the ideas of moderation and mental health as cultural constructs that are probably even a little more important than what the laws say, right?
Yeah, but I think we have to start from some point.
Right.
And the laws cannot be applied to each person differently. So if we just start from somewhere, and then if somebody gets caught, or driving under the influence, or doing something, more serious or more harmful to others. I think that's why we have courts and laws to, make the distinction and decide, what is the penalty for that. But we have to start from somewhere.
Yeah.
It can't be everything is wide open like it pretty much is right now, because look at the mess we're living in. And as kids, I have three of them. I always thought that they did much better as children when the lines around them were solid.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if, as society, if people don't know their lines and where we can cross, where we shouldn't cross, um, it's a very anxious life. It's a very unsafe life for everybody involved.
Structure helps. Clear boundaries help. I'm a big fan of personal responsibility. I think that helps. And I'm also a fan of freedom. So, like, how does this all work? I really don't know what the answer is. I have some mixed feelings about it all. And I mean, I just really focus more on individuals' health. That's really because that's what I do. I think I have the best understanding of that. And I think it's possible for some people to use some substances. Some people can have a glass of wine at dinner. Some people can even smoke marijuana occasionally, but it is not good to habituate. You will have a less creative, less attuned, less alive life. You will deaden yourself at some point, and usually there's other issues. So I don't really know the answer. I know those things. I've seen it for a long time, or true.
Yeah.
That these other issues are hard. I'm not sure I'm an expert at all on that.
When we come at it, I think from that societal management standpoint, right? That's the part that gets tricky. I think that we also have to try to accept that we don't come to anything. None of us are on a desert island somewhere setting up the ideal therapeutic community from step one, right? We're all in existing systems, and what works in one nation versus another, a whole different, geopolitical construct or whatever, and a whole different historical relationship with substances. So it's hard to say, well, what do we do? We have to go from, okay, where are we today and move forward? And I think that's hard. So I tend to think that it gets oversimplified when people look at that and just say, hey, am I allowed to do a thing? Because if that's all we're talking about is, am I allowed to go somewhere, buy a container of fill in the blank and go home and ingest it? Am I allowed to do that? And the complicated answer to that depends what that thing is, and if we have decided that you're allowed to do that legally or not. But that has nothing to do with, should I go and do that, really? From what we're talking about, from a standpoint of should I, and how much of that, and, should I do it at all? There's ethical, health, moral, subjective reasons. Who's in the home with me? Am I going to be able to be taking care of those that are dependent on me? Are they going to have to take care of me? Am I going to put them at risk or myself at risk, and how much risk and how much benefit, and why am I doing it? All of that is things that aren't legislated, that I think then, unfortunately, some people put too much stock in, oh, it's legal, so I can and I will, instead of being like, well, that's never in a treatment setting. That's never why we would say you should or shouldn't do something, is whether or not it's illegal. All as the only reason, right?
Right, but most people think that way. It's legal, so why can't? Do you know how many calls I get from people saying, I'm going to smoke my marijuana in treatment because it's for my anxiety and it's prescribed for me. And that is how they think, because it's illegal, it should be allowed and is the right thing to do.
And not
And
surprisingly, your experience, in your own career experience and your healthcare experience has been dealing with something that is prescribed by a doctor that people do take, right? I mean, when you think about opiates, that's where those problems start.
correct,
Mostly. Yeah.
correct.
So,
But again, then I go back to the mental health issue. I think obviously there was a combination of issues of opioids. It was the misleading pharmaceutical company information about what it was and the possibilities of addiction, and it was a time where, again, mental health assistance was not available. So a lot of people that started taking opiates for a back injury end up taking it because it just gave them an overall feeling of, of wellness that they didn't have for a very long time, and they couldn't distinguish between physical and emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was absolutely no control of who's prescribing where and how much. So I think the combination created the storm that we're still suffering from.
And then what's the obligation then publicly to say, do we make something available without any sort of follow up or accountability, and just because it does create, if you tell me it's legal for me to sell something, someone's going to start selling it. And is that person, I mean, our experience has been that people who sell things, even legal substances, let's look at alcohol and cigarettes and say, those are not the most ethical companies out there. That's not what they're famous for. Saying,
right.
How can we ethically take care of customers who are going to make this legal too? So when starts selling heroin, I'm going to make a note to cut that out. When some company,
yes.
So when some
exactly.
company, make a big note there. When some company decides to sell heroin, why would I trust that they're going to be responsible in how they do it?
But again, if some companies out there are selling forms of opioids that feel very much like heroin.
Yes.
That gives you an euphoria very similar to heroin. So again, I mean, it's such a complicated issue because you want the people that need help to get help. Mm-hmm. You want those suffering from pain to have quality of life.
No.
You talk about even cancer patients with marijuana. So it is what I was trying to say from the beginning. I think there should be some control, mm-hmm. some legislation about what should be prescribed, what shouldn't be prescribed, and responsible parties that are going to be liable to spread the happiness for too many people that cannot handle it.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. Because I truly believe it's harming society, and especially when
mm-hmm.
I say society, I'm talking about the younger generation, mm-hmm. the 20, 22, 23-year-old.
And the message that they get from that, from the policies about it and things.
Right?
Yeah. I wonder. I went a few years ago. I went to a conference. It was a conference specifically oriented around methamphetamine use and treatment. And there was a heavy dose of harm reduction approach. And we haven't talked a ton about the differences in this approach, I don't think, on this show. But one of the guys who had organized the conference, I got to talk to him a little bit. And he said that he was a harm reductionist, meaning that he would try to meet the patients where they're at and help them to make goals about their substance use. And when he described it, it sounded very similar to some of the Wiseman method philosophies that you've shared here, which is trying to get to know the patient, seeing where they're at, seeing what their needs are, trying to check in that they're being realistic and have their own health, and just kind of taking that health management approach. But he said that one of the things that was frustrating sometimes is he would get people on one side who would say, oh, you're, advocating like clean needle programs. So you're advocating for drug use. You're for drug use, pro drug use. And he said, I'm very much not. I'm a treatment professional. And then on the other hand, you get other people coming and saying, hey, you're telling people they should be safe with their drug use. We don't mind that, but you're also still saying people should stop. So you're not being like open enough on the other side. And so he'd get it. And it struck me that when you're trying to find a balanced answer to a complicated issue, you get people on both sides who are like, hey, you're too approving or you're too restrictive or whatever. And it's like, I'm just trying to figure something out. Does that make any sense?
Right. Perfectly. But it's in all cases, the movement is away from that which is destructive towards that which is healthy. But
that should be the goal.
I've said it before, right. But those are the two words that I think clarify things the best. Is this destructive to myself or someone else, or is this healthy for me? And to ask and answer that question honestly. And so if somebody is moving towards health, right, and doing something that's safer, and realistically, honestly, that's an improvement. It's a movement towards that, and that's as good as it's going to be. You're not advocating anything other than, safety is part of health, and moving towards, and based on where someone's at and what they're telling you, they're willing or able to do at any point in time. You have to work with that. Otherwise, there is no, you're not helping them. There is no work. And, and that isn't to say you can't, be confrontive at times or, and really see what is possible. But, the black or white thing is that type of binary approach is you don't have a working relationship usually. And so at any rate, I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it though, because I think that's the tricky part. There's some things I'm interested to see maybe what you guys think about this, but I've been interested lately to hear some of the research around some programs that they're not done in places that are decriminalizing the use, but they'll say, like, for example, I heard a doctor recently talking about a program that she's part of in West Virginia, where there's a lot of IV drug use. And so they have clean needle availability and, instructional things to people who can come in self-identified. They don't have to come in and, they don't go looking and labeling anyone, but someone can just come in and say, hey, can I obtain clean needles, and how do you safely dispose of non-clean needles? And they will give resources and information to that person. There's some research that indicates that someone who's an IV drug user might be less likely to die or less likely to spread infection to other people if they are being more safe within, right. Whereas ideally they would stop. But sometimes the policies of programs right. are stop or else, and that's all. And so then that person just goes and uses dirty right. needles. Yeah.
You're right. And you can do both. You can say, look, it's terrifying that you're going to do that. It's so dangerous. But if your mind's made up and that's what you're going to do, and you're telling me that, then please do it as safely as you can. And here's some information towards what that is. Right. And so it isn't as if you're advocating or, the danger is, and I think this goes back to the initial question about legality and what's authorized. I mean, the problem is once things are legal, some people think it's authorized, right? It's been authorized. Yeah, it's legal, right? Yeah. That's not taking responsibility for your life. And so I really think people get better when they take responsibility for their lives. And I think it's a big problem we have in our culture right now, where everybody's looking towards everyone else in terms of what's authorized or what's not, or what. And it's like, this is your life. What do you want? How do you want to live this? What do you really want for yourself? And then, okay, And then if you can get people to answer that, and by the way, it's the hardest question I ask people because they often don't want to answer it, or they haven't even formed it. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't formed that in your mind, you are so susceptible to being pushed and pulled in any direction.
But so, David, what you're talking about there is one of the most important things to be emotionally healthy is accountability for your own happiness, for your own being. And I think there's we see such fight towards that, It's not my fault. I didn't do this, Mm-hmm. I'm a victim of what happened. So is the accountability.
And it's where legislation meets healthcare, right? Because you're legislating, as you put it, Dave, if you don't have a relationship with someone, you don't know what they need. And so if I'm mm-hmm. making a rule for 1 million people, I don't know 1 million people, right? And so there's those rules. I remember when I worked in court-ordered treatment, there was a thing that went around, and Claire, you mentioned Kratom earlier, mm-hmm. which is one of those that kind of popped up. There was also Spice. Some people might be familiar with that concept, which was like it essentially was a chemically treated benign plant that so basically was trying to, the plant was benign, but the chemicals that were sprayed on it, and then when it was dried out and made so it could be smoked, they were the whole goal behind that existence was that it didn't show up on your standard drug tests. And so I would have these group therapy sessions with people who were on probation, and some of the people in the facility where I worked were just like, we're not even talking about that. That's you go out and use Spice. That's a full relapse. It's bad. Don't do it. If I find out you did, I'm telling your PO. And so that was, but I actually liked to encourage some conversation about it in the group, because what it brought out was the fact that people were making decisions on whether or not someone who's in like danger of legal trouble and or death because of their addiction problem is now making a decision on whether or not I should ingest something based off of whether someone can catch me doing it. And that's so dangerous for that to be, especially for someone who has been prone to addiction. I will say, that is a dangerous precedent and a dangerous thought process to reinforce. And so I would always encourage that we have these conversations amongst and saying, well, is it not a relapse just because I can't get caught by peeing into a cup? Well, what other things can happen that have nothing to do with anybody knowing whether or not I did that thing? Well, I could have a car accident. Well, I could be acting goofy at my job and get fired. Well, I could, whatever. And trying to have these discussions over, how does that impact my life, and how does that influence the way I make decisions? So nothing declarative there. I just thought it was very interesting to see when that decision making had been sort of outsourced from the individual, right? And it's been outsourced from my own brain to whether or not I'd get caught and in trouble. And if I won't get caught and in trouble, I'll probably do it. If I would get caught in trouble, I probably won't do it. And the incompleteness of that thought.
It's just hoping that people are going to be able to make, the decision. And when I say able to, is truly emotionally able to, not wanting to, but able to. I think there's a huge difference. And I wish everybody was, David, able to make those decisions on their own. I wish they were healthy enough that they actually knew, what's the best and healthier path for them. But that's not always the case. I mean, we see, with somebody that we're dealing right now that wants to come to treatment so bad, and we've been speaking to him for a month, and he wants it. He wants to be well, but he is emotionally not able to make a decision that is going to last, the end of the conversation with us because of mental health issues. So you feel, you know what I'm saying? Like you want to help this person, and you want to believe that everything he's saying is occurring, but you understand clearly that in 5 minutes from now, his thoughts are so confused and engaged in so many different areas that he won't be able to complete the process. So that's what I'm trying to say to you. I think going back to the law is never going to be able to be good for everybody. And
Absolutely,
actually,
yeah.
it's probably going to be harmful to a lot. But it has to be based on the majority at the time we are living. It can't be, a 100-year-old law. Things change. I think my kids have a very different perception of life and responsibility than I did.
No.
So I think the law should be based in, our society at this time and what's best for the overall society, thinking obviously in the repercussions, not just short term, but long term as well. And I think the long term is being forgotten.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like overall, I mean, if we're looking at the most accurate answer to a question like this is there are a lot of variables. We don't know for sure, but there's a lot more that has to be looked into and stabilized. I mean, I guess if we're looking for a either or answer, the answer to should drug use be legalized or unilaterally decriminalized, the answer is no. It's like one of those, what's the old expression, no with a but it's like, but we shouldn't say yes and we shouldn't say no and then stop the conversation. Definitely. That would be the worst
Correct.
outcome, is to say
Correct.
either answer and then stop the conversation. It's almost like, no, but there's a lot more we should talk about.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think that the way we engage with that would look very different if we felt more safe about a lot of things in society, I think, to that point. We can't really ask that question without asking a lot more questions that are difficult to answer, but would be really good and is really good when we see people working on those answers.
Yeah, I think the individualizing, our thoughts, not just about drugs, but everything. Looking at the intent where the action, is going to occur is very important. So, for some patients, using certain drugs is just a humane approach, is the right path. For some other patients, it's detrimental, risky, not just for them, but everybody around them. Looking at the person that you're dealing with, at that moment instead of, the overall. We do that a lot when David was saying about, even if somebody decides to do something bad, is, how safe can we make that bad situation be, we give patients naltrexone and Vivitrol, they are opioid blockers after detox. And it is so important, especially for David and what he does, to make patients really aware of the blocking, agents, what would happen if they use, and to explain them. If they really decide to use, when they should stop the blocker and what can happen if they use. Because, again, if they are decided to do that, we have to help them the safest way possible. Because that's the end result there. It's, life or death.
And we are going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you found today's conversation to be revelatory and get you thinking. I know I certainly did. This podcast is a production of the Wiseman Method Opioid Treatment Specialists and Rapid Detox Center. To learn more about us, go to opiates.com, email us info@opiates.com, or go on Twitter and just go @opiates. We got that one. So any of those are good ways for you to also contact us if you have questions that you'd like to see addressed on the show, or just questions and learning about treatment for opioid dependence and addiction and recovery as well. We are here for you to do that. Our music for the show is the song Medical by Clean Mind Sounds. This show is also produced by Popped Collar Productions, a company that will help you to start, maintain, host, and record your podcast, which you can learn more about at poppedcollar.net. For Claire Wiseman and David Livingston, I've been Dwight Hurst. Remember to ask questions so you can find answers, because if we can find answers, then we can find hope. Have a great week. Bye-bye for now.